Imagine a man who becomes the hero of an entire industry. A corporate savior who revives a sinking giant, doubles its value, earns headlines around the world, and even becomes a national icon in a country not his own. He's praised in business schools, idolized by investors, and immortalized in comic books. He is a symbol of globalization, of leadership, of transformation. Then one day, he's arrested accused of hiding millions in income, stealing from the company he rebuilt, and betraying everything he once represented. His legacy begins to crumble. He's placed in a foreign prison, isolated, cut off from the outside world, and charged with financial crimes that could keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. His passport is gone. Cameras watch his every move. Escape seems impossible. And then, like something out of a spy film, he disappears. No alarms. No chase, no warning, just gone. Hours later, he reappears on the other side of the world, having slipped through one of the world's most rigid legal systems by hiding inside a black music equipment box. A billionaire CEO, smuggled out of Japan in a case meant for speakers. This isn't fiction. This isn't a movie. This is the true story of Carlos Ghosn, the man who went from being the most powerful figure in the global auto industry to one of the most wanted fugitives in the world. His story is not just about business. It's about power, about ambition, about betrayal, manipulation, and the consequences of unchecked leadership. It's a story that exposes the fragile line between brilliance and arrogance and what happens when someone who seems untouchable finally falls. This is the dark side of success. Let's begin. Part 1. The Rise of Carlos Ghosn. From tire executive to industry savior. Carlos Ghosn was born on March 9, 1954, in Porto Velho, Brazil, to a Lebanese family of Maronite Christian background. From the very beginning, Ghosn's life was global. Raised in Brazil and later in Lebanon, he was shaped by a multicultural upbringing that would later give him the flexibility to navigate business across continents. He spoke several languages, understood different worldviews, and carried within him a rare mix of East and West. But what truly set him apart was his mind. After excelling in school, he moved to France for university, where he was accepted into the elite École Polytechnique, and later the École des Mines, two of the most prestigious institutions in Europe. These weren't just schools. They were the breeding grounds for future presidents, CEOs, and technocrats. Ghosn graduated as an engineer, but his true strength was leadership. He began his career at Michelin, the French tire giant. In 1978, his early roles involved factory management and industrial operations. But Ghosn wasn't content with simply keeping systems running. He wanted to fix what was broken, and that's exactly what he did. He was sent to Brazil to turn around a failing division. Within years, he did just that. Later, he was promoted to head Michelin's North American operations, where he orchestrated the integration of the newly acquired Uniroyal Goodrich Tire Company. Ghosn's talent for corporate turnarounds, his ability to slash costs, reorganize teams, and make brutal yet effective decisions, earned him a growing reputation in the business world. He was known as tough, demanding, relentless. But he delivered results. In 1996, Renault, the French carmaker, was facing its own struggles. It had a bloated structure, falling profits, and a risk-averse culture. They needed someone who could shake things up. Ghosn was hired as executive vice president. And shake things up he did. Within months, he launched sweeping cost-cutting campaigns, closed inefficient factories, and restructured the company's supply chain. His methods were controversial, but Renault's profits started to rise. Then came the moment that would define his legacy. In 1999, Renault entered into an alliance with Nissan, a struggling Japanese automaker that was drowning in debt. Nissan's debts exceeded $20 billion. The company hadn't turned a profit in years. Its factories were underutilized, its vehicles outdated, and its management resistant to change. Most analysts believed Nissan was beyond saving. Renault acquired a controlling interest in the company, and Ghosn was sent to Tokyo to lead its revival. The move was unprecedented. Never before had a foreign executive been handed the reins of a major Japanese company. The cultural divide was massive. In Japan, corporate decisions were made slowly, through consensus. Ghosn brought urgency, top-down control, and a willingness to make deep cuts. Many predicted failure. Instead, Ghosn delivered a miracle. He launched the Nissan Revival Plan, a sweeping 3-year strategy aimed at returning the company to profitability. He closed 5 plants, laid off over 20,000 workers, and reduced the number of suppliers by half. He eliminated unprofitable vehicle models and focused on innovation and global expansion. In just 2 years, Nissan turned a profit. Within 5 years, it became one of the most efficient automakers in the world. Ghosn became a legend in Japan, featured on magazine covers, praised in the press, and even turned into a manga comic book character. His nickname? The Cost Killer. By 2005, Ghosn had become CEO of both Renault and Nissan, a rare dual leadership role that gave him enormous power. In the years that followed, he oversaw aggressive expansion into emerging markets, pushed for electric vehicles before it was trendy, and turned the Renault-Nissan alliance into the world's 4th largest automotive group. To the public, he was a visionary. To investors, a miracle worker. To the boardroom, a force of nature. But behind the scenes, cracks were already forming. The same iron grip that had saved companies was beginning to stifle them. The leader who had once disrupted slow bureaucracies was now building an empire centered entirely around himself. Power, once a tool for transformation, was becoming a fortress, and the walls would soon begin to close in. Part 2. The empire expands. Control, secrecy, and the birth of a titan. By the early 2010s, Carlos Ghosn had achieved what few in the corporate world ever do: complete dominance over not one, but 2 of the world's major automakers. Renault in France, Nissan in Japan, and soon a 3rd piece would be added to his growing empire, Mitsubishi. In 2016, Mitsubishi Motors was rocked by a fuel economy scandal that severely damaged its public image and market value. As a strategic play, Nissan acquired a controlling stake in the company, bringing it into the alliance. With this, the Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi alliance was born, and it was massive. Together, the 3 companies accounted for over 10 million vehicles per year, making the alliance one of the largest automotive groups in the world, competing directly with Toyota and Volkswagen. At the center of it all stood Carlos Ghosn. No other executive had ever managed to hold such sweeping power across multiple global companies. He was no longer just a CEO, he was a symbol. To investors, he was a guarantee of success. To governments, a diplomat. To employees, a feared and respected figure. And to many in the media, he was a rock star of the boardroom. But power at that level changes people. And Ghosn was changing. Over time, his leadership style became increasingly autocratic. Decision-making was centralized. He had final say on nearly everything. Boards deferred to him. Subordinates obeyed without question. The charisma that once energized teams began to resemble control. He began traveling almost exclusively by private jet. He stopped using standard compensation models. His inner circle shrank. And most critically, his personal and professional finances began to blur. Ghosn's salary was always a point of tension, especially in Japan. While executive pay in Europe and the US was high, Japanese corporate culture traditionally embraced modesty and restraint. Ghosn's compensation, totaling over $17 million per year, made him the highest paid executive in Japan. And that was just the part people knew about Dot to avoid public backlash and potential shareholder revolt. Ghosn allegedly devised a complex system of hidden compensation agreements, deferred payments, offshore accounts, post-retirement bonuses, and undisclosed stock options. These packages were not officially reported in the company's public filings, and that was just the beginning. He allegedly used company funds to finance lavish lifestyle expenses, private residences in Paris, Beirut, and Rio de Janeiro, all paid for by Nissan, a luxury yacht, dozens of business-class flights for family members, renovations to properties that were not used for corporate functions, even the hosting of a lavish party at the Palace of Versailles under the guise of a company event, which in reality was his own birthday celebration. At this level of wealth and influence, lines blur easily. But in Japan, hiding income from regulators and misusing company funds isn't just unethical. It's illegal. Meanwhile, inside Nissan, resentment was building. Some executives believed that Ghosn had grown too powerful and that the alliance was putting Renault's interests above Nissan's. After all, Renault held a 43% voting stake in Nissan, while Nissan only held a 15% non-voting stake in Renault. Despite being more profitable and larger in scale, Nissan had less control over the direction of the partnership. For years, Ghosn kept the tensions contained through personal diplomacy and sheer force of will. But by 2018, things were slipping. Key insiders at Nissan began quietly cooperating with Japanese authorities. An internal audit was launched. Documents were leaked. Conversations recorded. And slowly, the picture came into focus. Carlos Ghosn wasn't just a brilliant businessman. He was, allegedly, a man running a shadow system of financial deception. The final moment came on, November 19, 2018. Ghosn landed at Tokyo's Haneda Airport, believing he was attending a scheduled meeting. Instead, he was arrested by Japanese prosecutors, escorted out of his private jet, and placed into custody. The charges: underreporting compensation by tens of millions of dollars. Misuse of company assets for personal gain, breach of trust, and violation of financial disclosure laws. The news exploded globally. Within hours, Ghosn was removed from his position as chairman of Nissan. Renault hesitated at first, but pressure was building. Mitsubishi followed suit. A man once celebrated as the glue holding the alliance together was now being cut out of it entirely. Ghosn, from his detention cell, denied all charges. He claimed it was a corporate coup orchestrated by Nissan insiders who feared his plans to merge the companies permanently, a move that would have given Renault full control and turned Nissan into a subsidiary. According to him, the arrest wasn't about justice. It was about power. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain: Carlos Ghosn was no longer in control. The empire was beginning to collapse, and the man who once moved markets with a sentence was now behind bars, waiting to see what would happen next. Part 3. The fall, prison walls, betrayal, and a legacy in crisis. Carlos Ghosn had spent the last 2 decades living like a king. He flew in private jets, stayed in luxury penthouses, hosted parties in royal palaces, and commanded respect in boardrooms across continents. But on November 19, 2018, all of that disappeared in a matter of minutes. He was arrested at Tokyo's Haneda Airport and transported to a cold, gray detention facility in northern Tokyo. No private chefs, no advisors, no assistants. Just fluorescent lights, cement walls, and absolute silence. Japan's legal system is notoriously strict. Unlike Western countries, where suspects are quickly charged or released, Japan allows prosecutors to detain a suspect for up to 23 days without formal charges, and that's just the beginning. In Ghosn's case, they would detain him, release him on bail, and then rearrest him on new charges, effectively restarting the process each time. The cycle repeated itself for months. Ghosn was interrogated for hours each day, often without his lawyer present. He wasn't allowed access to his wife or children. He couldn't speak to the media. He was not allowed to use a computer. Every interaction was monitored. He slept on a thin futon mattress. The food was plain, often cold. For a man used to world-class comfort, the contrast was staggering. But worse than the physical discomfort was the loss of control. For decades, Ghosn had managed billion-dollar decisions with a phone call. Now, he couldn't even send an email. Every aspect of his life was in someone else's hands. Still, he fought. Through his lawyers, he denied all wrongdoing. He claimed that all compensation was lawful and that certain payments were deferred and planned transparently for after his retirement. He said the properties in Rio and Beirut were part of his global executive duties. The Palace of Versailles party? A misunderstanding. Nothing more, but the Japanese prosecutors were determined. The charges expanded. Was now accused not only of underreporting income, but also of transferring $5 million of Nissan funds to a company linked to his personal use. He was hit with multiple counts of aggravated breach of trust, a serious offense under Japanese law. From the outside, the story looked like a classic tale of corporate corruption. But inside Japan, and within the international legal community, debates began to swirl. Some called the prosecution politically motivated. After all, Ghosn was a foreigner leading a key Japanese company. Others said it was a strategic takedown orchestrated by Nissan executives who feared a full Renault takeover. Many pointed to the timing. Ghosn had been exploring the idea of fully integrating Renault and Nissan, making the alliance permanent. This would have reduced Nissan's independence significantly. In France, many still viewed him as a victim of betrayal. In Japan, he was seen more as a symbol of arrogance. And the media? They were split. Some journalists ran exposes, digging into the payments and real estate transactions. Others investigated the internal politics at Nissan and reported signs of deep internal rivalries, factions that had long resented Ghosn's dominance. Meanwhile, back in Tokyo, Ghosn's world was unraveling. Renault, under pressure from the French government and shareholders, demanded his resignation. He stepped down as CEO in January 2019. Mitsubishi followed suit. Nissan erased him from corporate materials, boardroom photos, and internal communication. His legacy was being scrubbed away in real time. Then came a moment of defiance. In April 2019, after months in detention, Carlos Ghosn was released on bail, a rare decision in Japan, especially in high-profile cases. He walked out wearing a surgical mask and a construction worker's uniform to avoid the cameras. The disguise didn't work. The world knew exactly who he was. He quickly organized a press conference. Sitting in front of dozens of cameras, Ghosn defended himself with fire. "I am innocent. I have been wrongly accused and unfairly detained. This is a conspiracy. I was targeted by Nissan executives and manipulated by prosecutors. I will fight this with everything I have." But if he hoped to turn public opinion, he was mistaken. The court hit back fast. They imposed strict bail conditions. He couldn't contact his wife. He couldn't access the internet freely. He was prohibited from traveling. He was required to live at a registered Tokyo residence under 24/7 surveillance. He had gone from a prison cell to a prison disguised as a luxury apartment. And then, the final blow. Ghosn's trial was postponed until April 2021, nearly 3 years after his initial arrest. For Ghosn, this wasn't justice. It was slow-motion execution. He was 65 years old, facing years of legal warfare in a country where 99% of criminal trials end in conviction. The system was built for guilt, not redemption. And so, somewhere during those quiet nights in Tokyo, A new plan began to form. One that had nothing to do with press conferences or legal battles. He wouldn't wait to be convicted. He wouldn't fight in court. He wouldn't be made an example of. He would disappear. The escape that followed would become one of the most unbelievable stories in corporate history. Part 4. The escape, disguises, boxes, and a vanishing act. Carlos Ghosn was out on bail, but he was not free. Japan's legal system had granted his temporary release, but under extraordinary restrictions. He couldn't leave the country. He was tracked by cameras. His internet access was limited. His meetings were logged. Even his conversations with his own wife were forbidden. He was essentially under house arrest in a foreign land. But behind the scenes, Ghosn was already planning something far more dangerous than any courtroom battle. He wasn't going to wait for justice. He was going to take it, or at least escape it. And what he pulled off would soon become one of the most audacious escapes in corporate history. The setup planning an international escape while being watched constantly is like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube while handcuffed. Every move has to be perfect. But Ghosn had one advantage: money. He still had millions at his disposal, loyal friends and supporters in multiple countries, and most importantly, access to professionals with backgrounds in military, intelligence, and private security. Enter Michael Taylor, a former U.S. Green Beret and private security contractor with a history of executing complex extractions in hostile environments. Alongside his associate Georges-Antoine Zayek, a Lebanese-American with deep ties in the Middle East, Taylor crafted an escape plan that sounded more like a Hollywood screenplay than real life. The strategy was based on a loophole in Ghosn's bail conditions. He was allowed to leave his apartment during the day to attend meetings, as long as they were logged and within city limits. There were no rules about guests visiting him at private venues. That was the opening. The disguise. The plan began on December 29, 2019. Michael Taylor and Zayek arrived in Japan, posing as a pair of musicians traveling for a private concert. They checked into a hotel in Osaka with 2 large black audio equipment cases, the kind used to carry amps, speakers, and lighting gear. These cases were real, heavy, and modified to allow for airflow and room for a human being inside. That same day, Ghosn left his residence in Tokyo. He was reportedly headed to a nearby hotel for a legal meeting. Nothing unusual, at least on paper. But there were no cameras inside the hotel. And once inside, he met with Taylor and Zayek. Then came the switch. Ghosn changed clothes. He crawled inside one of the large black boxes. It had air holes drilled into the bottom to keep him alive during the trip. The box was closed, latched, and incredibly never inspected. Hours later, the box was loaded onto a private jet at Kansai International Airport, headed for Istanbul, Turkey. The jet had been chartered under a false name by a shell company. At 11:10 p.m., the plane lifted off the runway. Carlos Ghosn had just slipped past every surveillance camera, every checkpoint, every legal guardrail the Japanese justice system had put in place. And no one had a clue. The transit. The flight to Istanbul was roughly 12 hours. Ghosn remained hidden in the case the entire time. Once in Turkey, he was quietly transferred to another private jet, this one bound for Beirut, Lebanon, the country of his ancestry, a nation with no extradition treaty with Japan. The entire operation, from Tokyo to Istanbul to Beirut, was completed in less than 24 hours. By the time Japanese authorities realized what had happened, Ghosn was already across 3 borders and beyond their reach. The World Reacts news of the escape broke on December 31, 2019. A man under international investigation for financial crimes, a man banned from leaving his residence without approval, had just escaped the country, undetected inside a box. The media exploded. Some outlets called it the corporate jailbreak of the century. Others laughed at the absurdity of it all. Billionaire businessman, a man who once negotiated international mergers, now reduced to smuggling himself out of Japan like contraband. Governments scrambled to respond. Japan was humiliated. They immediately began an investigation into airport security failures, loopholes in bail enforcement, and internal leaks. Interpol issued a red notice, formally requesting that Ghosn be arrested and returned to Japan. But Lebanon refused. Lebanon's stance was simple. Carlos Ghosn was a citizen. There was no extradition treaty. He was home, and he was untouchable. The press conference just days after his arrival in Beirut, Carlos Ghosn staged a massive press conference, his first public appearance since his arrest more than a year earlier. He walked onto the stage with cameras flashing, journalists packed shoulder to shoulder, and a room buzzing with anticipation. Then, calmly and with remarkable composure, he spoke. "I have not fled justice. I have escaped injustice. I was a hostage in a country where the presumption of guilt has replaced the presumption of innocence, where discrimination is part of the legal system, and where basic human rights are denied." For nearly 2 hours, Ghosn laid out his version of the story, painting himself as the victim of a corporate coup, vilified by his own board, manipulated by a hostile justice system, and betrayed by the very people he made rich. To some, it was a masterclass in image control. To others, a performance full of spin and self-pity. But the man who had once ruled boardrooms was back in control of the narrative, at least for a moment. The escape, fallout, the aftermath was just as dramatic. Michael Taylor and his son Peter, who helped organize the escape, were arrested in the United States in 2020 and extradited to Japan. They were later sentenced to multiple years in prison for aiding Ghosn's escape. Turkey also launched an investigation into the second leg of the flight, the Istanbul to Beirut connection, and arrested multiple airport employees and flight personnel. In Japan, authorities overhauled bail procedures, increased monitoring technology, and intensified international legal pressure on Ghosn's allies. But it was too late. The man was gone, and the trial would go on without the defendant. Ghosn in exile as 2020 unfolded and the world turned its attention to the global pandemic. Carlos Ghosn faded from the headlines, but not from the story. He stayed in Beirut, surrounded by family, still giving interviews, writing books, and defending his name. He made bold accusations that the Japanese government had been complicit in his takedown, that Nissan board members had plotted behind his back, that his arrest was never about justice, but about preventing the merger that would give Renault full control. And all the while, he never expressed a single note of regret for how he left. Carlos Ghosn had escaped the system, but he hadn't escaped the spotlight. And in the years to come, that spotlight would only grow hotter. Part 5. Legacy in Ruins, The Price of Power. Carlos Ghosn had escaped the courtroom, the jail cell, and the country that once celebrated him. But there was one thing he could never outrun: his legacy. Back in Japan, the dust of his escape hadn't settled. It had stirred something even deeper: a political embarrassment, a legal crisis, and a corporate identity shattered by scandal. Nissan, the company he once saved, was now fighting to survive without its architect. Its leadership was fractured, its reputation damaged, its profits evaporating. By 2020, just months after Ghosn's escape, Nissan posted a $6.2 billion annual loss, its worst in over a decade. Shareholder confidence collapsed. The company's stock plummeted. Its product pipeline stalled. Innovation, once at the core of Ghosn's strategy, was now on hold as internal leadership tried to clean up the wreckage left behind. Renault, too, was shaken. The alliance that had once been the pride of global cooperation between East and West was now crumbling under the weight of its own internal mistrust. Ghosn had been the glue that held it all together, the singular figure who could manage the cultural divide, Between French ambition and Japanese tradition. Now, the alliance resembled a broken pact. Board meetings grew tense. Partnerships frayed. And the once promising future of the Renault Nissan Mitsubishi alliance was reduced to survival mode. Meanwhile, Ghosn, safely in Lebanon, was trying to reclaim his place in the world, not as a fugitive, but as a misunderstood hero. Reinventing the narrative, Carlos Ghosn never admitted guilt. Not once. Instead, he rebranded himself as a symbol of judicial abuse, positioning his arrest and escape as part of a broader pattern of political persecution and corporate betrayal. He began giving interviews. He co-authored books. He launched a public relations campaign to clear his name. He appeared at forums, universities, and business panels, virtually or through pre-recorded statements, still trying to shape the global narrative about what had really happened. In one interview, he described his escape not as cowardice, but as strategy. If I had stayed in Japan, I would have died there. Not physically, but professionally. My reputation would have been destroyed, not because I was guilty, but because the system is built to eliminate resistance. But for every interview he gave, new investigations emerged. The global legal web titans France, once his strongest base of support, launched formal legal proceedings in 2022. French prosecutors accused Ghosn of funneling millions through questionable channels, from luxury events hosted at the Palace of Versailles to suspicious payments routed through a car dealership in Oman. Though Lebanon refused to extradite him, Interpol notices remained active, and Ghosn became effectively trapped in Beirut. Free from jail, yes, but a prisoner of borders, unable to travel without fear of arrest. In the United States, the Securities and Exchange Commission had already fined him and Nissan for failing to disclose compensation. In Japan, the legal machine continued to process evidence, not for trial anymore, but for history. The state was determined to document everything. Michael Taylor and his son Peter, the men who had helped Ghosn escape, were convicted and imprisoned. Several Turkish airport workers were also jailed. The chain of consequences extended across 3 continents. And yet, the man at the center of it all remained untouched by handcuffs, but not by judgment. The collapsing myth. Ghosn's greatest achievement had always been his image. He wasn't just a CEO. He was a transformer, the man who could rescue broken companies, merge entire industries, and redefine what modern leadership looked like. He was global, dynamic, disciplined. A businessman who could speak 5 languages, manage operations across time zones, and thrive in chaos. But now, that image was disintegrating. The very traits that had made him a savior, ambition, fearlessness, control, had mutated into something else entirely. Critics now described him not as a visionary, but as narcissistic, secretive, obsessed with power. The comic books in Japan were gone. Magazine covers replaced with mugshots. The boardroom whispers had turned into full-blown indictments. Perhaps the greatest irony of all was this. Carlos Ghosn had built his legacy on turnarounds, saving companies from destruction. But in the end, the empire he built couldn't save him from the consequences of his own ambition. The legacy that remains today. Carlos Ghosn lives in Beirut, in a house paid for, at least in part, by Nissan during his time as CEO. He is under no legal obligation to return to Japan. He remains technically free, but also permanently confined. He cannot travel to France, the US, or any country with an active extradition agreement with Japan. He cannot re-enter the corporate world. He cannot rebuild what he lost. What he can do, and continues to do, is speak. And in his speeches, one theme dominates: that he was wronged, not by his actions, but by a world too narrow to accept a leader like him. But for all the defenses, one thing is clear. Carlos Ghosn's legacy is no longer defined by the profits he generated, the factories he saved, or the cars he built. It is now defined by the escape, by the scandal, by the question marks he left behind. Carlos Ghosn's story began as one of triumph. He was the global CEO who didn't just lead, he transformed. A man who walked into failing companies and turned them into world leaders, who defied cultural barriers, rebuilt dying brands, and became the architect of one of the most powerful automotive alliances in history. He was praised, celebrated, even NYTHOLOGIZED. But in the end, his legacy wasn't forged in a boardroom. It wasn't sealed in a merger agreement. It was locked inside a box, the one he used to flee the consequences of his own actions. What Ghosn built was extraordinary, but how he lost it is unforgettable, because his downfall wasn't caused by a market crash, or a bad investment, or even a failed product. It was caused by the very traits that made him great. His confidence became entitlement. His authority turned to secrecy. His brilliance crossed the line into control. And when power goes unchecked, when no one dares to say no, even the smartest minds in business can lose their way. That's the truth at the core of this story. That success alone doesn't protect you. It exposes you. And the higher you rise, the farther there is to fall. Carlos Ghosn didn't just escape Japan. He escaped accountability. He escaped justice, at least the kind measured in courtrooms. But he couldn't escape something far greater, history. And history will remember him, not just as a genius, not just as a fugitive, but as a man who built an empire so large, so powerful, and so dependent on himself, that the moment he was gone, it all began to crumble. This is what happens when success is worshipped, when power is hoarded, and when leadership becomes isolation. This is not just the story of Carlos Ghosn. This is a story about ambition, corruption, and control. This is the dark side of success.